Helen Crawford had lived her entire life in the quiet farmlands of Nebraska, where the wind swept through golden fields, and faith was as much a part of the landscape as the corn and wheat. At 73, she was a familiar figure in her town, silver-haired, soft-spoken, and always dressed modestly in pastel cardigans and long skirts that danced just above her ankles. Folks at her church called her Miss Helen, a name said with the same reverence one might offer to a treasured hymn. She had taught Sunday school for over 40 years, baked endless trays of cornbread for potlucks, and was never seen without a Bible tucked under her arm. To Helen, faith wasn't just a belief. It was her identity. She had been baptized at 9, saved at 12, and by 15 she was already tithing from her allowance with scrupulous precision. 10%. No more, no less. It was a number etched into her spirit, as sacred and solid as the 10 Commandments. As life rolled forward, marriage, children, widowhood, retirement, she never once failed to tithe. Whether the bills were tight or the winter propane bill higher than expected, Helen always made sure her 10% was given before anything else. If she had $10, 1 belonged to the Lord. If she had 100, 10 went into the envelope, sealed with a prayer. Over the years, this act of giving became more than just habit. It became a shield, a kind of spiritual insurance policy that made Helen feel secure in her walk with God. She believed with all sincerity that her consistent tithing was evidence of her righteousness. She had no doubt that by fulfilling her financial obligation to the Lord, He would, in return, keep her and her loved ones safe, healthy, and favored. It wasn't arrogance. It was certainty. A quiet confidence that she had done her part, just like the good book said. Helen didn't ask questions about it. She didn't wonder if there was more to the story. In her mind, faithfulness was about obedience, and obedience meant following what was written. The command was clear. Bring ye all the tithes into the storehouse. That was scripture, plain and simple. So she followed it like a soldier follows orders, not out of fear but out of deep, unwavering loyalty. It gave her comfort to know there was something she could control in a world that often felt so uncertain. Her pastor, a younger man with a sharp haircut and booming voice, often praised the tithers from the pulpit. "You want blessings?" he'd say, thumping the Bible. "You've got to sow the seed. You've got to give God what's His." The congregation would nod, say, "Amen," and Helen would sit a little taller in her pew, heart swelling with quiet pride. She was one of the faithful ones, the obedient ones, the ones who got it. While others struggled to give, Helen gave without question. Every Sunday her envelope was ready, neat, precise, her name written in cursive across the front. But beneath her quiet smile and polished faithfulness, Helen had never truly examined the deeper meaning behind her giving. It wasn't that she was heartless. Far from it. Helen was kind, generous with her time, always ready with a listening ear or a plate of cookies for a neighbor. But when it came to tithing, it was purely transactional. She never asked God what He truly wanted. She never pondered whether her giving came from a place of love, or merely from a sense of duty. To Helen, tithing was a rule, one of many she followed to the letter. It was her way of doing right, her way of staying in God's good graces. And as far as she could tell, it had worked. Her life had been orderly, stable, and blessed in many ways. She had seen others fall into hardship, illness, or scandal, and in her heart, she believed her faithful giving had spared her from much of that pain. She didn't boast about it, but she carried it like a quiet badge of honor. Even in her later years, when her hands grew stiff with arthritis and her memory began to falter, Helen never forgot her tithe. She kept a small spiral notebook by her bed, where she wrote down every penny she received from Social Security, every gift, every odd check from quilting commissions or baked goods. 10% of each entry was circled and marked T for tithe. It was one of the few things that still made sense to her as her world grew blurrier. In a mind slowly unraveling, the numbers remained fixed. And so, on a late October afternoon, as the wind rustled dry leaves outside her window and a football game murmured softly from the television, Helen sat in her favorite recliner, checkbook open, tithe envelope beside her, and closed her eyes just for a moment. That moment, though, would mark the end of everything she thought she understood, and the beginning of a revelation that would change everything. For a long time, Helen Crawford had believed that as long as she kept doing the right things, praying, attending church, tithing without fail, God would keep her life steady. And for decades, that seemed to hold true. Her days followed a quiet, comforting rhythm, reading her Bible by the window each morning, grocery shopping on Wednesdays, prayer meetings on Thursdays, and church on Sundays, always with her tithe envelope in hand. But beneath that steady exterior, something subtle had begun to change. Something she didn't want to admit, even to herself. It started with little slips. She'd misplace her reading glasses and find them in the freezer. Forget a name she'd known for years. Ask her daughter the same question twice in the same conversation. At first, she laughed it off. "Senior moments," she'd say, brushing a hand through her thinning gray hair. "Everyone forgets things now and then, right?" But the moments came more often, and they stopped being funny. Helen would walk into a room and forget why she was there. She'd stare at the stove, uncertain how to start it. Once, she showed up at the post office holding a check meant for church tithe, thinking she was there to mail a birthday card. The worst came when she got lost just 2 blocks from home. She'd taken that walk to the bakery 100 times. But suddenly, nothing looked familiar. When a kind neighbor found her crying near the high school football field, Helen knew she could no longer pretend. Her daughter, Ruth, took her to the doctor. The appointment was long, quiet, and filled with uncomfortable questions. Helen sat clutching her purse while the neurologist gently explained the results of her cognitive exam and MRI. "Early-stage Alzheimer's," he said with a voice soft like cotton but heavy like stone. Ruth's eyes welled with tears. Helen simply nodded, her face calm, but her chest tightening with a fear she couldn't name. Still, even then, Helen clung to her routine, especially her tithing. If her mind was going to slip, then her discipline would hold her together. She told herself, "As long as I can count 10%, I'm still me." Every week, Ruth helped her balance her checkbook, and Helen made sure the tithe envelope was filled, sealed, and placed on the foyer table by Saturday night. It was her anchor in a world that felt like it was slowly tilting. But as the weeks passed, her world shrank. Conversations became harder to follow. Familiar hymns escaped her. She once asked the pastor how long he had been preaching, forgetting that he'd baptized her granddaughter years earlier. At night, she dreamed of numbers, columns, calculations, endless 10% figures repeating like echoes in her mind. It comforted her in a way. Math didn't forget her. Ruth moved into the house to care for her full time. Friends from church brought casseroles and sat with Helen on the porch, watching the birds. Sometimes she remembered their names, sometimes not. But she always remembered to ask, "Did I give my tithe this week?" And every time Ruth reassured her, Helen would close her eyes and whisper, "Good. Then I'm right with the Lord." Then came the afternoon when everything changed. It was a late October Sunday. The leaves outside her window burned golden red against a pale Nebraska sky. The wind rattled dry corn stalks in the field beyond the backyard. Helen had just returned from church. Though she could no longer follow the sermon, she still sat quietly in the third pew on the left, her tithe envelope clutched in her worn hands. Back home, she settled into her favorite recliner, the one by the window where the sun warmed her legs just right. Ruth turned on the television for background noise, a soft hum of an old football game. Helen didn't care who was playing. She simply looked outside, her eyes following the swirling leaves, her mind floating like them. She felt tired, more tired than usual. A weariness that went beyond her bones, deep into the parts of her she could no longer name. She let her head rest against the cushions, eyes fluttering shut, hands folded gently across her lap. And then, silence. There was no pain, no panic, no awareness of slipping away. One moment she was sitting in her chair, surrounded by fading memories and the soft ticking of a wall clock. And the next, she was standing. No longer tired, no longer confused. Her body felt light, strong, whole. Her hands, once bent and trembling, were smooth and steady. She blinked, and the living room was gone. In its place was something she could only describe as light. Not just bright, but alive. It didn't come from one direction like a lamp or the sun. It was everywhere, soaking through the air itself. And it wasn't blinding. It was warm, gentle, familiar, as if she had known it her whole life but never fully seen it. Helen looked around in awe. There was no fear, no confusion, just peace, pure and unshakable. And then, she saw him. A figure stepped forward from the light, quiet, radiant, clothed not in robes but in glory itself. Her heart knew before her mind caught up. It was Jesus. He didn't speak at first. He didn't need to. His eyes met hers, and in that single gaze, Helen felt more love than she had ever imagined possible. A love that saw everything she had been, every tithe, every prayer, every forgotten name, and still welcomed her as a daughter coming home. She wanted to say something, anything. But before she could, he smiled and whispered, "You're home." And in that moment, Helen Crawford believed she had reached her eternal reward, until she realized that the true journey had only just begun. Helen Crawford had always believed she'd done her part. She had walked the narrow road, steady, faithful, and upright. She tithed 10% of every dollar that came her way, never missing a single Sunday, even when her cupboards were sparse and heating bills high. She had followed the rules, all of them. But nothing in her earthly understanding had prepared her for what she was about to face. As she stood in the presence of Jesus, time seemed to stop. The brilliance surrounding him wasn't the kind that hurt your eyes. It was soft, like morning sun through lace curtains, pure, living light that embraced her soul instead of blinding it. And though no words were spoken at first, she could feel something stirring deep within her. A knowing, a quiet ache, like a memory trying to surface. Jesus didn't need to introduce himself. She knew. Every fiber of her being recognized him, as if she had known him her entire life, yet never truly seen him until now. His presence wasn't overwhelming in the way she'd expected. There was no fear, only love. Vast, uncontainable love. It washed over her like warm water, seeping into every crack and crevice left dry by years of routine and religious performance. Then, without a single word exchanged, something remarkable began to unfold. Before her, as though projected into the very air around them, appeared the scenes of her life, not in fragments or faded memories, but in vivid clarity. Every moment, every choice, every heartbeat, was displayed in a way she had never experienced before. It was as if her soul was watching itself from a distance. No edits, no filters, nothing hidden. At first, she smiled. She saw her baptism as a little girl in the chilly waters of the creek behind her grandparents' farm. She saw herself singing hymns in the choir, her voice clear and strong. She watched as she helped neighbors through hard times, dropped off homemade pies for the grieving, and whispered prayers for strangers she passed in the grocery store. She saw the years of service, folding bulletins, preparing communion trays, visiting shut-ins. And then, the giving. She watched herself preparing tithe envelopes, always with care. She saw herself calculating the exact 10% with precision, as though balancing a spiritual checkbook. Week after week, year after year, she placed her envelope into the offering plate with the same focused expression, the same quiet conviction. She never missed, never hesitated. And yet, for the first time in her entire life, Helen saw what Jesus had seen all along. She had given, yes, but not from a place of joy. She saw herself giving from obligation, from fear, from habit. She saw the calculations scribbled in her notebook, the circled T beside every income line, like a tax. She saw the moments when she gave despite struggling, but not because she trusted, rather because she believed that if she didn't, the blessings would stop. She saw herself in church, nodding along to sermons about sowing and reaping, clapping when the pastor declared, "You've got to give to receive." But deep down, she hadn't been thinking about generosity. She had been thinking about protection, about earning God's favor. She saw the Sunday mornings when she passed by someone crying in the next pew, but didn't stop to ask what was wrong, because she was too focused on getting her tithe in on time. She saw herself walking past the homeless man outside the pharmacy, clutching her envelope tightly in her purse, telling herself, "I've already given." Helen's breath caught. There was no condemnation in Jesus' eyes, only sorrow, gentle, steady sorrow, the kind that only comes from love, a love that longs to be known but has been misunderstood. Then he spoke, not loudly but deeply. His voice seemed to echo not just around her but within her. "You were faithful in your giving, Helen," he said, "but you never asked me what I truly desired." The words struck her like a wave. She wanted to defend herself, to say she'd followed the Bible, obeyed the commands, done exactly what was taught. But even before the words could form, she knew. She had done the act, but missed the heart. She had treated tithing like a spiritual checklist. 10%? Check. On time? Check. Diligent? Check. But where was the trust? Where was the surrender? Where was the love? Helen's knees weakened. Her heart swelled with a mix of regret and realization. The tithe had become her safety net, but it had also become a wall between her and the deeper relationship Jesus had always longed for. "You trusted the number more than you trusted me," he said with no anger, just aching truth. Tears welled in her eyes, not tears of punishment, but of awakening. In her mind, she had imagined this moment, meeting Jesus, would be about reward. She had hoped to hear, "Well done, my good and faithful servant." And perhaps she still would. But before that, Jesus had to show her what she hadn't seen. And what she hadn't seen was everything. She remembered times she gave out of guilt, not generosity. Times she withheld time or compassion from someone in need, telling herself her tithe had already covered it. Times she avoided deep questions of the heart because it was easier to follow a rule than to face relationship. Jesus lifted his hand again, and a new scene appeared. She saw others, people just like her, lined up every Sunday, envelopes in hand, heads held high. But Jesus showed her their hearts. Some gave joyfully, lovingly, with hands open and hearts surrendered. Others gave like she had, out of duty, with a quiet desperation that said, "If I don't give, God won't bless me." "It was never about the money, Helen," he whispered. "It was always about the heart. The words wrapped around her, breaking something open. All the years she had thought she was doing it right suddenly seemed so small in the light of what he truly wanted. Not obligation, not precision, not ritual. He wanted her, all of her time, her trust, her kindness, her presence, her heart. Helen wept. For the years lost in calculation, for the people she'd passed, for the opportunities missed. And still, Jesus stood before her, not to punish but to redeem, not to shame but to awaken. In that moment, Helen didn't just feel forgiven. She felt known, and for the first time in her life, truly free. But the journey was far from over. What Jesus would show her next would change everything she thought she knew. Not only about giving, but about love, eternity, and the kind of life that pleases God most. Helen Crawford had thought she'd seen it all. Her life laid bare in the presence of Jesus. The quiet realization that she had trusted in the act of giving more than the one she was giving to. The ache in her soul had been deep, but it wasn't the kind that destroys. It was the ache of awakening, of understanding something long misunderstood. But as Jesus stood beside her in that place of endless light, Helen sensed there was still more. Something heavier. Something she wasn't sure she was ready to see. Jesus reached out his hand again, not to rebuke, but to reveal. And in an instant, the scene around her shifted, not violently, but with a gentle power, like a curtain being pulled back to show what had always been there. The radiant light faded, though not completely. It was replaced by something else, something quieter, more reverent. And before her, a new vision began to unfold. She saw heaven, not a dream or a metaphor, but something living and real, beyond words yet entirely tangible. It was more beautiful than anything Helen had ever imagined during her quiet moments in church pews or early morning devotionals. The streets didn't glitter with gold like children's Sunday school drawings. Instead, they shimmered with peace. There were no grand mansions or pearly gates carved with names, only open places filled with love, laughter, and light that didn't shine from above, but seemed to radiate from within. She saw people, not just angelic figures, but men and women, old and young, all clothed in something purer than fabric. Their eyes sparkled with joy. Their smiles weren't forced. No one was rushing. No one was anxious. And most remarkable of all, everyone gave. They gave without hesitation, without ledger, without calculating what would be left over. They gave their time, their joy, their stories, their very presence. They didn't give to earn favor. They gave because they loved. Helen stood mesmerized as a woman she didn't recognize offered her hand to a weeping man. No words, just kindness. A child shared his song with a group of elders who closed their eyes and listened as if it were a treasure. No rules, no reminders, no fear, just the rhythm of love freely given. Jesus turned to Helen and said gently, "This is what I have always desired. Not that my children would give because they must, but because they love." Helen's heart swelled. For a moment, she wanted to stay here forever. But Jesus' expression shifted, still loving but solemn. "I need you to see the other side," he said. And with that, everything changed again. The light around her dimmed, not into darkness, but into a deep, heavy shadow. Not a place of torment, but of stillness, sorrow, and longing. Helen found herself in a place she could only describe as a valley of regret. It was not hell. There were no flames, no wailing or demons, but the weight in the air was thicker than any pain she had ever known. She looked around and saw people, hundreds, maybe thousands. Their faces weren't twisted with pain, but bowed with sadness. Not sadness because they had been cast out, but because they had finally understood. Too late. Some stood alone, eyes cast downward. Others reached out, their hands pausing in the air as if trying to touch something no longer within reach. Their lips trembled, but they made no sound. She felt their thoughts, not through voices, but through spirit. They were reliving choices, revisiting moments, recalling sermons they had heard but never heeded. They weren't condemned, but they were crushed under the weight of what could have been. Jesus stood beside her, silent at first. Then he spoke, not loudly, but with sorrow that reached to the marrow of her soul. "These are the ones who followed the rules but missed my heart." Helen gasped. She recognized faces, people from her own church. The quiet man who always sat 2 rows behind her. The elderly widow who used to count every penny of her tithe, but always left after service in silence. A couple who had served on every committee but never smiled at a stranger. People she had thought were doing it right, just like she had thought she was. She saw herself too, not the Helen standing beside Jesus now, but the Helen from years ago, clutching her tithe envelope, avoiding the woman silently weeping in the pew beside her, walking past the struggling single mom at the gas station, reassuring herself, "I've already given. I've done my part." And she saw others who had done the same, faithful in appearance, precise in ritual, but distant from love. Jesus turned to her again. They believed that giving was enough, but they never gave themselves. Tears streamed down Helen's face. Not because she feared for her own soul, Jesus had already shown her grace, but because now she understood what she had missed, and how many others had missed it too. She watched as Jesus knelt beside a weary man in the valley. He didn't scold, he didn't condemn. He simply placed a hand on the man's shoulder, and the man wept, not in terror but in awakening. Even here Jesus was love. Even in this place he longed to be known. Helen turned to Jesus, her voice cracking. "Is there still time for them?" He looked at her, eyes full of fire and water, justice and mercy, all at once. For some, yes. For others, their lives have passed, but their stories may still reach those who walk the same path. And with that, Helen understood. She wasn't seeing this vision for herself alone. She was being shown the sorrow of an entire generation of believers, men and women who had confused duty with devotion, rules with relationship. People who had thought that giving money was the highest mark of obedience, when all along, what God wanted most was their hearts. Helen turned back toward the light, heart pounding with conviction. Everything she thought she knew about giving, about faithfulness, about what it meant to walk with God, it had all been surface level compared to this. The tithe was never the goal. It was a symbol, a reflection, and when it became a substitute for love, it lost its meaning entirely. She looked at Jesus, trembling. "Lord, what do you want me to do?" He smiled, tender and strong. "Go back. Tell them what you've seen. Not all will listen, but some will finally hear." Helen nodded, her spirit full of awe. She hadn't reached the end of her journey. She had just begun the real work, the work of waking hearts, not wallets. Helen Crawford had just seen heaven, not just the idea of it, not a poetic version shaped by sermons or songs, but the real thing. She had stood where love lived unhindered, where people gave of themselves without hesitation, and where trust in God was so natural it didn't need to be taught. And then, she had seen the other place. Not hell, not torment, but a sorrowful valley of regret where souls lingered, having missed the heart of God despite years of faithful rituals. Now, standing again in the warmth of Jesus' presence, she felt overwhelmed, not with fear, but with awe. There was so much she hadn't known, so much she had misunderstood. And Jesus, he hadn't scolded her. He had shown her. Tenderly, patiently, lovingly. Every step of the way, he had peeled back the layers of her well-meaning religiosity to reveal something deeper. That tithing had never been about money. It had always been about surrender. About trusting God not with a percentage, but with everything. Helen stood in silence, the light around her humming softly like the hush of a sunrise. Jesus didn't speak right away. He didn't need to. She could feel his heart, as clearly as she had ever heard a voice. And within that silence, something stirred. A question. A possibility. She turned to him. Lord, what happens now? His eyes held hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. Not intimidating, but infinite. It was like standing in the gaze of both a father and a friend, one who had waited patiently for her to see what he had always longed to give. You have been given another chance, he said quietly, his words like a gentle wind. But now, you must choose. Before she could ask what he meant, the light shifted again, not into darkness, but into something breathtaking. Before her, two paths appeared. They weren't paved roads or grand staircases, but spiritual choices, unfolding with clarity that went beyond vision. One path led deeper into the light. Helen could see it. Eternal peace, unshakable joy, and the complete rest of a soul that no longer needed to struggle. There was no time, no waiting, no wondering. Just wholeness, completion, the full embrace of heaven. Her body ached to step forward. After all, hadn't she run the race? Hadn't she endured long enough? But then, her eyes turned to the second path. This one didn't shine. It looked ordinary, earthly, lined with sidewalks and hospital rooms, Sunday services and coffee shop conversations. There were no angels or radiant souls. There were people, tired, confused, searching. Some were holding tithe envelopes, others were sitting in church pews with hollow eyes. Still others were walking through their lives believing they had done enough, all while their hearts remained distant from the one who loved them most. Helen's heart clenched, because she recognized them. She had once been one of them. She turned back to Jesus, her voice barely above a whisper. If I stay, who will tell them? The question hung in the air like a prayer. Jesus didn't answer with words. He simply looked at her, and in his gaze she knew the answer. If she stayed, she would be at peace. But if she returned, lives could change. Not because she was perfect, but because she had seen. Because she now knew what so many still misunderstood. That tithing was never the destination. It was only a signpost. That God didn't want what was in your wallet. He wanted what was in your heart. Helen dropped to her knees, her spirit trembling. Lord, she said, tears streaming down her face, I choose you, not just here, but there, in life, in everything. He knelt beside her, placing a hand on her shoulder. And for a moment she felt everything. His love, his sorrow, his longing for his people to come home not just in eternity, but in their hearts today. Then he whispered, Go, and tell them. The light exploded around her, warm, full, consuming. And then, suddenly, it was gone. Helen gasped. She was back in her body. The weight of it hit her all at once, bones aching, breath ragged, heart fluttering. Beeping monitors surrounded her. Voices shouted, hands gripped hers. Someone cried out, She's back. Oh my God, she's breathing. Ruth's face came into view, soaked with tears. Mama, she whispered. Can you hear me? Helen blinked slowly. Her throat burned. Her limbs were weak, but something inside her had never been stronger. Because she remembered. Every moment, every word, every face, every truth. She had been to the other side, and now she'd come back. Not for herself, not for comfort, but for a mission. To awaken the sleeping hearts. to free those still trapped in the chains of routine religion, to tell the church that tithing was not the end goal, but a symbol of a heart surrendered in trust and love. Over the following days, as Helen regained strength, she knew one thing with unshakable certainty. She could never go back to who she was before. She couldn't sit in a pew and pretend. She couldn't nod along to sermons about obligation without speaking about transformation. She couldn't remain silent while good-hearted people gave faithfully, but never truly gave themselves. Because Jesus hadn't sent her back to keep quiet. He had sent her back to speak, no matter the cost. And she would. Even if her voice trembled, even if others doubted her, even if some rejected her story, she would speak. Because she had been given another chance, and she would not waste it. Helen Crawford had lived her whole life in quiet obedience, serving, giving, doing everything she thought was right. But now, back from a place few return from, she carried a truth so profound, so urgent, it pressed against her heart like a fire that wouldn't be quenched. The words Jesus had spoken still echoed inside her. Go and tell them. At first, she didn't know how. How could she possibly explain what she had seen, what she now knew? Lying in that hospital bed, her body still weak, her voice barely a whisper, Helen wrestled with it all. Doctors called her recovery a miracle. Her heart had stopped. Her brain had been without oxygen for nearly 10 minutes. And yet here she was, alert, remembering every detail. But it wasn't just survival. It was purpose. When her daughter Ruth sat beside her, gently rubbing her mother's hand, Helen looked at her with tears in her eyes and said softly, "I saw him." Ruth leaned closer. "Who, Mama?" "Jesus," Helen whispered. "He showed me everything." Ruth's eyes widened, her lips parting slightly as emotion flooded her face. "Tell me," she said. And so Helen did. She spoke slowly, her words quiet but sure. She told Ruth about the light, how it wasn't just light but living light, filled with warmth and peace. She described meeting Jesus, how his eyes saw straight through her yet held no condemnation, only love. She shared the life review, how she had thought her tithing had secured her place in heaven, only to realize she had been giving out of fear and duty, not from trust and love. She told her daughter how Jesus had shown her the two places, the place of joy where people gave freely from surrendered hearts, and the place of sorrow where regret lived, even among those who had once been considered righteous. Tears streamed down Ruth's cheeks as she listened. "Mama, I believe you," she said, choking on her words. "I really do." But not everyone did. When Helen was strong enough to go home, she knew she couldn't keep the message to herself. She had to speak to her church. For decades she had sat in the same pew, tithed faithfully, served with diligence. Now, she was going to stand before those same people and say, "We've missed the point." Her pastor, a man in his early 40s with polished sermons and a deep love for order, gave her a kind but cautious welcome. "Of course, Sister Helen," he said, "you're always welcome to share a testimony." He smiled gently but wore the look of someone expecting a sweet near-death anecdote, not a challenge to long-held doctrine. That Sunday, the sanctuary smelled faintly of pine cleaner and coffee. Sunlight streamed through stained glass, casting soft color across the pews. Helen stepped up to the pulpit, her hands shaking slightly but her voice clear. She began with her illness, how the Alzheimer's had taken her memories. Then she told them how she had died, how she had met Jesus, and how he had shown her that tithing, in the way she and many others had practiced it, had become a transaction rather than an offering of the heart. "I had given my 10% every week," she said, looking out at familiar faces. "But I hadn't given my heart. I hadn't surrendered my trust. I was faithful, but I wasn't free. The room grew still. Some leaned in, some sat motionless, some began to fidget. Helen took a breath and pressed on. Jesus told me something that broke me and healed me all at once. He said, "You've been generous with your offerings, but you have withheld yourself." Friends, that was me. And if I'm honest, I think it might be some of you too. A murmur moved through the pews. She saw some people wipe their eyes. Others looked down at their hands. But not everyone received the message with grace. After service, a few approached her with hugs and tears. "I've felt it too," one woman whispered. "Like I've been doing all the right things, but still feel far from God." But others weren't so gentle. A deacon crossed his arms. "Tithing is biblical, Sister Helen," he said, his tone more defensive than curious. "Are you saying we don't need to give?" "No," Helen replied calmly. "I'm saying we need to give more, not just from our wallets, but from our lives. Jesus isn't after our money. He's after us." Some nodded. Others walked away in silence. Over the following weeks, Helen shared her story again and again. At women's Bible studies, over cups of coffee in living rooms, in grocery store aisles and on porch swings. Some believed her, others didn't. But the more she spoke, the more people opened up. A man at church confessed he had tithed for years out of fear that something bad would happen if he didn't. A young couple admitted they had given up on giving altogether because they felt they could never meet the expectations. Helen listened to them all, and each time, she gently pointed them back to what Jesus had shown her. That giving is not about checking a box. It's not about securing favor. It's about trusting God enough to let go. About living open-handed, not just with money, but with time, compassion, presence, and love. In her quiet moments at home, Helen still kept her old tithe notebook. But now, she used it differently. Instead of logging numbers, she wrote down names, people she had helped, encouraging notes she had sent, time she had spent with someone lonely. She called it her heart ledger, because now she knew, God's not adding up decimals, He's reading hearts. By the time winter had settled over Nebraska, blanketing the fields in quiet white, Helen Crawford's life had taken on a new rhythm, one not measured by doctor's appointments or memory lapses, but by testimonies, conversations, and whispered confessions. What had begun as a near-death experience had become a divine mission. And though Helen never imagined that, in her final years, she'd be standing in front of groups of strangers with a microphone in her hand, that was exactly what she was doing, because Jesus had told her to go and tell them, and she wasn't about to let fear or age stand in the way. Word of her story spread, first in her small town, then to neighboring counties. Invitations started coming in, a Methodist women's retreat in Kearney, a small Baptist gathering near Lincoln, a community fellowship hall in Des Moines. People were curious. Some were skeptical. Others were quietly desperate for something real, something deeper than the Sunday rituals they'd followed for decades. At every event, Helen shared her story, not with the dramatic flair of a preacher, but with the raw humility of a woman who had been broken and reassembled by truth. She never changed her message. It remained simple and unsettling. God never wanted your money. He wanted your heart. Some people wept when they heard it. "I've been giving out of fear for years," one elderly man confessed, his voice cracking as he clutched Helen's hand after a church luncheon. "Afraid if I didn't, he'd take my wife, my health, my job. I never realized. I never understood." Others responded with silent nods, heavy with the weight of unspoken memories, of years spent following rules, filling envelopes, hoping they were good enough. For many, Helen's message didn't just free them, It undid decades of shame and obligation. But not everyone welcomed it. More than once she was pulled aside by pastors with tight smiles and guarded eyes. "Sister Helen, we appreciate your passion," one said, trying to sound gracious. "But you know, tithing is biblical. We don't want to confuse the congregation." Helen smiled gently. "I'm not here to take away the Bible. I'm here to give back the heart of it." The pastor didn't respond. In some places, she wasn't invited back. In others, her story sparked uncomfortable conversations in Sunday school rooms and church board meetings. A few people whispered that maybe she'd just had a vivid dream. Maybe her mind, clouded by illness and medication, had imagined it all. One woman from her own church said, "Helen's always been sweet, but I think this whole near-death thing might be a little exaggerated." But Helen didn't waver, because she knew what she had seen. She knew what Jesus had said, and she knew the price of silence. So she kept going, not with sermons or debates, but with truth wrapped in gentleness. She'd sit across from widows at potlucks and share about the people she saw in heaven, how they gave not because they had to, but because they loved to. She'd remind them of how Jesus had knelt beside the sorrowful in that place of regret, not to condemn, but to awaken. She'd tell them, "You don't have to live in fear. You can live in freedom." And the freedom was spreading. At one church in Kansas, a small group of seniors started a living, open-handed circle. Not a financial campaign, but a ministry of presence. They committed to giving their time, love, and attention to anyone who needed it. They visited nursing homes, wrote letters to widowers, cooked meals for single moms. One 70-year-old woman named Betty said, "I haven't stopped tithing, but now I tithe with my soul too." In Iowa, a retired farmer began visiting the men's shelter every Thursday. "I used to think writing a check was enough," he said. "Turns out Jesus was waiting for me at a folding table next to a man who hadn't had a hot meal in 2 days." People weren't abandoning tithing. They were reclaiming it. They were beginning to see that giving money was just one way of honoring God. But giving yourself, that was the true offering. Helen's message wasn't about tearing down churches or throwing out scripture. It was about taking the legalism out of love and letting the heart of God breathe again in the lives of his people. And yet, it remained a hard word for many, because it demanded more than money. It demanded surrender. But Helen had learned something in that bright place beyond the veil, a truth she carried like a lamp into every room she entered. Jesus wasn't asking for more dollars. He was asking for more hearts. The tithes that pleased him were never about decimals or deductions. They were about devotion, the kind that leaned in when someone cried, the kind that forgave before being asked, the kind that gave up time, not just treasure, the kind that didn't ask, "What do I owe?" but said, "Lord, all I am is yours." That was the message, and Helen would share it as long as she had breath. Because somewhere out there was someone still afraid, still wondering if they'd given enough to be safe, to be loved, to be accepted. And she needed them to know. Jesus wasn't waiting for their checkbook. He was waiting for their yes. Helen Crawford never imagined that her golden years would be spent speaking in sanctuaries, nursing homes, fellowship halls, and even community centers with broken chairs and flickering fluorescent lights. But ever since Jesus had sent her back, she had felt the undeniable tug of purpose each time she stood before a listening ear. She didn't do it for applause. There was none. She didn't do it to be understood, because many still doubted her. She did it because her heart had been set free. And once you've tasted that kind of freedom, you don't keep it to yourself. By now, she had shared her story in dozens of places. She'd seen grown men cry, She'd watched lifelong churchgoers sit in stunned silence. She'd heard older women whisper, "I thought I was the only one who felt this way." And she'd hugged widowers who told her that her message gave them hope to start again. Sometimes she left smiling. Sometimes she left heartbroken. But every time, she left obedient. She never promised people more money, more miracles, or easy answers. She simply told them the truth, that giving to God was never supposed to be about a number. It was supposed to be about love. It was supposed to be about surrender, about trust, about a life so open to Jesus that generosity flows naturally, not just through checkbooks, but through footsteps, phone calls, prayers, and kitchen tables. And people were starting to listen. Her home church, once stiff with tradition, began to feel different. Not because they canceled the offering, but because something deeper was being passed through the pews. A fresh spirit of kindness, a willingness to see one another, a hunger to love, not just to give. One Sunday, a young mother stood up at the end of the service, cradling her toddler. She shared how someone in the congregation had slipped her a grocery gift card when they heard her fridge was nearly empty. "That did more for me than 100 sermons," she said, tears catching in her throat. "For the first time in a long time, I felt seen." And that, Helen realized, was the kind of giving heaven remembered. Not what came from habit or fear or guilt, but what came from a heart that saw people the way Jesus did. She often thought back to that final moment in his presence, just before she was sent back. The brilliance of his eyes, the weight of his words. "I do not want what is in your hands. I want what is in your heart." That sentence had changed everything. It became her anthem, her North Star. And now, it was becoming something more. A legacy. Because Helen understood now that this message wasn't just for her. It was for the church. It was for generations who had been taught to tithe without ever being invited into intimacy with God. It was for the givers who were generous with dollars but guarded with love. It was for the tired souls checking boxes, never realizing that Jesus wasn't grading their obedience. He was waiting for their trust. And it was for the next person who, like Helen, might think they've done everything right, only to discover they'd missed the most important thing of all. One evening, after returning home from a small gathering in a rural church off a dirt road, Helen sat by her window with a warm cup of chamomile tea. The sun was dipping behind the horizon, coloring the sky in soft pinks and golds. A light breeze rattled the leaves, and for a moment, everything felt still. She thought about how far she had come, not in miles, but in understanding. From a woman who once clung to her tithe envelopes like life preservers, to someone who now measured her day by how much love she gave away. She closed her eyes and whispered, "Lord, I gave you my 10% for years. But now I finally understand what you really wanted." A tear traced down her cheek. It was never about 10%. It was always about all in, all her trust, all her heart, all her life. And that was the message she had been sent to deliver, again and again, until her final breath. Because someone, somewhere, needed to hear it, not just with their ears, but with their heart. Helen Crawford's journey began like so many others, rooted in tradition, obedience, and a sincere desire to honor God. From her childhood in the heartland to her golden years in the pews of a small-town church, she had done everything right. She tithed with precision, attended services faithfully, and followed every rule she had been taught. Her life was steady, secure, certain, until it wasn't. Until her body failed and her spirit crossed the threshold into eternity, where all earthly calculations faded, and only truth remained. It was there, in the presence of Jesus, that Helen came face to face with a sobering realization. She had given faithfully, but not freely. She had followed the formula but missed the heart. Her tithing had become a transaction, 10% given in exchange for perceived blessing, rather than an outpouring of love, trust, and surrender. And she was not alone. Jesus had shown her not only her own life but the hidden sorrows of many who had done the same. People who believed they were safe because they gave, yet never truly gave themselves. People who mistook ritual for relationship and obligation for offering. But Jesus had not condemned her. He had called her to return, not to resume life as usual, but to awaken others, to speak boldly, to love deeply, to help the church remember what it had forgotten, that the offering God desires most is not measured in dollars or percentages. It is measured in surrender, in love, in lives laid open and hearts unguarded. And so Helen returned, older, frailer, but more alive than ever. She stood before congregations and kitchen tables, before doubters and believers, with a message that challenged the comfortable and revived the weary. God never needed your money. He wanted your heart. Some resisted, some listened, some wept. But Helen spoke anyway, not because it was easy, but because it was right. She watched lives begin to change, not by abandoning tithing, but by redeeming its purpose. People gave again, not to secure blessing, but because their hearts overflowed. And for the first time in a long time, the church began to breathe again. Not because it was perfect, but because it was awake. Helen's journey is not just a story. It's a question for every soul still clutching envelopes with trembling hands, every heart quietly wondering, have I done enough? And the answer, whispered gently from heaven through the lips of an old woman made new, is this: Jesus is not asking for more of what's in your hand. He is asking for all of what's in your heart. So today, whether you're 35 or 85, whether you've tithed all your life or never given a cent, pause, reflect, and ask yourself, am I giving because I love? Am I trusting Him fully? Am I living open-handed, not just with my money, but with my time, my kindness, my presence? Because in the end, it won't be the envelopes or the numbers that heaven remembers. It will be the hearts that gave freely, completely, joyfully, just like Helen learned to do. And maybe, just maybe, that's the offering that changes everything.